actually quite interesting in terms of cognitive terms. If you lecture a lot, one of the things you actually find is if you have chalk, it slows you down to the level of the audience. Whereas slides, you can actually go quite quickly. I'm finding this works the same way. It makes you just slow down a little bit. Yeah? So some advice on that. I want to start off by making some key distinctions. There's a huge difference between a method and a framework. So Scrum, for example, is a method, it's not a framework, whereas SAFe purports to be a framework. Now, that distinction is going to be important because the nature of proof and the nature of evidence is very different. Yeah? Methods fit within frameworks. Yeah? Methods can be validated empirically. You can say, did this make a difference in many ways? With a framework, there are so many things which are a part of it, it's very difficult to validate in quite the same way. Yeah? Okay, sorry. I just need to realize what's going on here. One of the things I've been working on for some years is to actually argue that empirical methods are generally problematic at a framework level. So the idea you can use cases to actually validate something is rather difficult, and there are several reasons for that. One is the issue about sample bias. Yeah? So if, for example, you draw your entire framework from 2 or 3 cases, that would be SAFe as an example, you haven't got enough data to actually build something on which you can make a claim. Even if you gather a large amount of cases, you've got the danger of confusing correlation with causation. Right? So, for example, if Poland wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes, all they have to do is increase chocolate consumption. Chocolate consumption directly correlates with Nobel Prizes, and dark chocolate is a tighter correlation than chocolate in general, so that gives you some guidance. Now, that's obviously a nonsense, but that's what you actually see in many methods. Somebody says, I studied these 5 companies, these 10 companies, they all did these things. If you do these things, you will get the same result. Now, I'm going to knock a few shibboleths here today, by the way. So if you take lean startup, all right, there's nothing wrong with the idea of doing things quickly, of pivoting, of being open to experiments. But you haven't got a prescriptive recipe, because we did a lot of work in Silicon Valley when I was in IBM, and we studied companies on a more disciplined way than was done for the lean startup book, because we also studied companies who failed as well as those who succeeded. And what we found is all the companies who succeeded did all the same things as the companies who failed. What you've actually got is a market. Yeah, the market is so big, some are bound to succeed. Yeah, so you can't take the behavior in that way and use it in quite the same approach. Also, there are often simpler explanations, and this is going to be the first thing I'm going to introduce as a concept. If anybody's read a book called Good to Great by Jim Collins. Okay, this is one of the classics of management literature. It's non-trivial. It's a serious professor. They carry out a whole body of structured interviews, including open questions. They identify a group of companies who've been progressively successful for a long period of time. Most of them are currently failing, but let's forget about that because that's a bit embarrassing. And then they identify things they do in common. Then they do the correlation causation thing and say, if you do these things, like the hedgehog principle, you will get the same results. Yeah, and from that, you get a consultancy method and a build-up and everything else. Now, if you take one look at that book and you've got any idea whatsoever about evolutionary biology, you say, but you picked the apex predators. You picked the first company into a novel market who stabilized that market so they were bound to succeed. So there's a simpler explanation. Now, let me go through apex predator theory because that's really important for the agile community at the moment. Yeah? So what actually happens there's a lovely film you can look at. If you look up Trophic Cascade and Yellowstone on the web, you'll find a beautiful film about what happened when they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone National Park. And that improved water quality. Now the reason is the wolves were the apex predator. They were wiped out by man. That meant the deer population went up. There were no predators for the deer. The deer grazed riverbanks decayed, water got polluted. You reintroduce the apex predator, deer population is predated, they don't graze the riverbank, water levels improve. Yeah, we're actually reintroducing beaver into Scotland at the moment, and that's actually producing an improvement. There's an argument for wolves as well. Yeah? Now what actually happens is when a market completely destabilizes and something new emerges, you're going to get a new apex predator. So when the meteor wipes out the Earth, yeah, and we get the dinosaurs disappear, if you had to predict who would be the next dominant predator based on who came before, you'd go for the crocodile or the shark. You wouldn't go for the first mammal. Yeah, the point is, when an ecosystem gets radically disrupted, the previous apex predators are over-optimized for the previous environment. They don't survive. And something small and very energy efficient comes in instead. So let's look at this in the history of IT, and then start to apply it to Agile. So around about the 1920s, IBM dominates the emergent field of technology. The reason it can do that is it repurposes punch card machines. It's developed punch cards to control sewing machines, yeah, and it can actually take that technology sideways to give it first mover advantage in a new field. And from the 1920s to the 1980s, nobody can displace IBM. Yeah, I was working in my early days at that point. If the IBM salesman came in, you'd lost. Yeah, IBM didn't have the best kit, it didn't have the best services, but it had that dominant predator position, i.e. nobody would displace it. Yeah? But then the trouble with apex predators is they become vulnerable when what they sell becomes commodified. So as we come into the 80s, hardware becomes a commodity. It becomes cheaper and cheaper. It becomes easier to procure. IBM don't see that because they're the apex predator, so they can continue to command the value proposition. So they're immunized from the weak signals of pending failure. And then when the market moves from hardware to software, they're unable to adapt, and they almost went under. And of course, the next apex predator is Microsoft. And now remember, Microsoft were paid by IBM to develop Windows in order that they could actually produce a PC. And IBM didn't think software was relevant, so they let Microsoft keep the software. And Microsoft realized the potential, so they repurposed it to create what was the next dominant predator for the next 20 or 30 years. And then software becomes a commodity, but Microsoft are immunized because everybody buys Microsoft, corporate purchasing departments do it, and they don't see Apple coming. Yeah, this is a lovely phrase from anthropology, objects of material desire. What Apple realized is it doesn't matter about hardware and software, you want something beautiful which works for you. Yeah? And actually, if you look at it in terms of market capitalization, Apple is now the largest. And they repurpose Next. Yeah? The Next system, which was a brilliant object-oriented development language, got repurposed to create the OS operating environment. Now notice in all cases, as a market becomes commodified, as it becomes highly stable, then a new predator emerges left field, small, energy efficient. That destabilizes the environment. That apex predator then dominates the next period until the environment destabilizes again. Now, it's a really important concept to get because it applies to adoption of new ideas in companies as well as markets. Yeah? Now, where we are with Agile at the moment is commodification. It came in as a novel idea. It was radical. It was new. It was small. It was highly energy efficient. And increasingly, people started to consolidate it into formal methods, Scrum, Kanban, and so on. And then at the end of its life cycle, and sorry, it is now at the end of the life cycle, you get the emergence of SAFe, the alliance of Scrum Alliance and less. You're gradually getting this huge, massive, dominant frameworks. And the big six, the big consultancy firms, are now moving in big time. If you actually look at it, they're acquiring agile consultancies very fast at very high PE ratios. They're paying over the odds because they want to own a market that they can ship in large amounts of people on utilization. So we're seeing agile consultancy companies who've been very successful for about 10 or 15 years suddenly losing out as corporate purchasing departments by agile from their existing suppliers. Yeah, the Accentures of this word, the PricewaterhouseCoopers, the Boston Consulting Groups, and so on. All of those are signs of a market consolidating into what has become a commodity. So one of the things for us all to look for is what's coming next. Yeah? And to be honest, what I hope is something comes next which matches the spirit of Agile. Because Agile, it was about doing small things fast, about developing things quickly, about high levels of flexibility. But it's now become rigid codified frameworks with accreditation skills, with certification skills. The principal market for Agile these days is training, coaching, and certification, not software development. Yeah? And that actually is an indication of something coming to the end. Yeah? Now, if you're actually in an adoption curve within a company, if for your company Agile is completely novel, then you're in a new entry type position. This is fractal, it's self-similar. So you have to work out, is an idea dominant? If it's dominant and it's early stages, you've got to fit in with it. Remember this with Telstra, they were going Agile and they still had Waterfall projects. There's nothing wrong with Waterfall in certain contexts. I'll come back to that in a minute. But nobody got promoted if you weren't part of the latest fad, which was called Agile. So they started to run one-year sprints so they could call themselves Agile. Now, I thought that was quite clever, really, all right? But you see the problem, all right? People have this attitude that there is a one-size-fits-all. There's always the one new wonderful thing that we should follow. Yeah? So to finish off my point on Agile, before I move into some other science and then move into Cynefin, Agile now seems to have consolidated into large, massive frameworks like SAFe. And what SAFe does is just take anything which is called Agile and throw it into a framework with diagrams. Yeah? A release train is just a hierarchy drawn sideways, right, in terms of silos. Yeah? They just included DevOps. It was just thrown into the framework because the whole purpose of SAFe is to consolidate ownership of methods and training. Yeah? And that's a classic end-of-life cycle phenomenon. At the other end, we've got the increase of individual coaching schemes and people running 2-day courses in how to be happy. Now, I've got no problem in people being happy, but it really isn't going to make much difference to software development or strategy. Right? Happiness is an emergent property of an interesting workplace. It's not a quality you can train people to have. Yeah? Okay, so having made that point, and you can guess who the targets are of both of those, you can work from there. Yeah? So we need to start to think anew, act anew, to quote Lincoln. Yeah? Now, one of the things I started to do several years ago is to start to build off natural science, not social science. My original degree is a joint honours in physics and philosophy. That taught me to have a contempt for social science from two completely different disciplines. Right? Natural science can replicate, social science can't. Yeah, somebody can study 15 or 16 companies, they can come to a conclusion. Somebody else can study the same companies and come to a completely different conclusion. There's no replicability. You can't repeat your experiments. So the approach I started to develop originally in IBM, then also now on my own within the university, is to actually say, what does natural science teach us about systems and about people, and to use that as a constraint around which you develop methods and frameworks. So methods should derive from natural science, frameworks should derive from natural science, and methods should be consistent or coherent to what we know about from nature. So let me run through a couple of those. Now, I've given you one, apex predator theory. The first predator into a new environment, basically the rest of the ecosystem self-organizes around the dominant predator, so the dominant or apex predator survives no matter how incompetent they are until the ecosystem shifts. So one of the first and most important things to do in strategy or operations or anywhere is to work out where you are on the dominant predator cycle. There's a whole blog post I wrote on this. Yeah? Early stages, serve the dominant predator. You could call that a hyena strategy. Yeah? Increasing stabilization, increasing commodification, the opportunity is now opening up for something new to enter left field, but it will be low energy, highly adaptive. Yeah? So in strategy terms, that's what you do first. What's the context? Second thing, and this is about people, and this is called inattentional bias. So let's take the example I normally use. You give a bunch of radiologists. Now, radiologists study X-rays. They come off a 3-generation body of knowledge. And by the way, working out how many generations of knowledge there are is quite important. IT is currently a 3-4 generation body of knowledge. The medical profession is a 50 or 60 generation body of knowledge. Aircraft industry a 5 or 6. The number of generations who've gone through something determines the amount which is known and the amount which has been learnt through failure. Yeah, so the longer a profession has been in place, the more knowledge is built into the processes. The younger the profession, the more cautious you've got to be. So we need to be really cautious in IT because we haven't built up that body of experience. So radiologists, 3-4 generation body of knowledge, they're dealing with a very limited information set. An X-ray doesn't have a huge amount of information in it. If you give a group of radiologists a batch of X-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, and one of the X-rays you hide a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of an average cancer nodule, 83% of the radiologists don't see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. We do not see what we do not expect to see. And you can't train yourself not to do that. I've just invalidated systems analysis, case-based approaches, and everything else. People will only see what they expect to see. They come in with a hidden bias. If you conduct more than 2 or 3 interviews, your brain forms a subconscious hypothesis, and you literally only pay attention to things that match that hypothesis thereafter. Right? Now, sorry, that's life. So you can either try and pretend it's not the life and try and train people to do something otherwise, which is a futile task, or you can say, well, how do we deal with that differently? Well, one of the ways we do it, for example, is we use a process called mass sense. I've just come from the States where we're looking at working this on current political crises. We just did one, for example, on North Korea. So we presented an infographic on North Korea to BBC foreign correspondents, civil servants from the government we were working for, and foresight specialists worldwide, and got them all to interpret it in the same 10-minute period. And from that, drew contour maps, like landscape maps, to show dominant views and minority views on a real-time feedback basis. So the 17% of people who see the gorilla now become visible as an outlier cluster. Now you see how we now work with science, not against it? We say all human beings are cognitively biased, so I increase the number of human beings in the equation, I prevent collusion, prevent gaming, and now I can find minority views as well as majority views. That, by the way, is a whole new approach to evidence-based policy in corporations. It's one of the things IT can do for its organization because it can network all of the staff. So faced with an intractable problem, organizations produce the problem as an infographic, distribute it to all of their staff or wider networks. Those networks interpret it, and we present back a contour map to show dominant and minority and conflicting views. Right? Now that's called mass sense. Doing the same thing at the moment on cybersecurity. So we present an infographic about a major security breach. We get everybody in the company to interpret it. We get them to tell a story of why they don't think it could happen here, and produce a scenario of what they think will happen on cybersecurity over the next 10 years. That allows me to draw what's called an attitudinal map, which shows attitudes to security, which are a lead indicator, whereas compliance is a lag indicator. We do the same thing with cultural mapping, by the way. We present gaping void cartoons or infographics. You choose those, you index them on an index set drawn from cultural anthropology, and we draw effectively a dispositional map, a landscape map, in which dominant cultural views show up as hollows, as tight contour lines, and minority or outlier views show up effectively as like outlier hills, in a plane. So you map where things are, you don't start with what you want them to be. And by the way, this is a key aspect of modern approaches in IT development or anything else. You start with where people are. You don't start with where you would like them to be at some stage in the future. There's more reasons for that from complexity. So that's recognizing cognitive bias and working with it. And again, that's the principle we're trying to do. This is what science teaches us. Let's work with that. Next thing, complexity science. This is the last science I introduced today. There's a lot more. So within nature, there are 3 types of system: ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. Now, the way this works is, and I'm going to use the constraint-based definition. Now, there's a whole typology of constraint. Constraint mapping is a huge new technique. I haven't got time to go into that now. In fact, I'm teaching that in London in the next couple of days. But basically, I'm going to define this in terms of constraints. So if I have a highly constrained system, that means the system has rigid boundaries. I know what's in and I know what's out. The linkages between all the elements in the system are rigid and defined. That's called an ordered system. In an ordered system, everything is predictable. there is a linear relationship between cause and effect. I can say, if I do this, this result will always arise. Right? That's a familiar area. That's kind of like where engineers would like us to be. Yeah? And it works very well in things like operating theatres. So in an operating theatre, they count the number of surgical instruments left at the end of an operation and check it's the same as were there at the start. As I get older, I think this sort of thing is of increasing importance, and I know the figures on how many people had to be opened up a second time because doctors left things inside them, right? It's actually quite easy to do. There's lots of blood and stuff around the place. It's actually a double-figure percentage until they did this. So this seems desirable, but remember, in order for that to be achieved, the people taking part in the operating theatre go through on average 10 or 15 years of training. The process of going into the operating theatre, the scrubbing up process, is a ritual act which aligns identity with role, so that when the doctor puts up their hand, the nurse knows what instrument to place in it. There's a huge investment gone into creating a system which can have predictability. You can't replicate that into an environment without the same training. And that's the mistake people make. They see something which works in one context, checklists. They try and apply it in a completely different context, and then it fails. So there is a high cost to order and a high reward if you can achieve it. But it can be taken to excess. I worked for IBM for 7 years. That taught me more about bureaucracy than anything else in my life. And I hasten to add, I didn't volunteer, I was conscripted. They bought the company I worked for. We were an Anglo-Dutch systems house. We were actually the company they bought to create the prototype for what became IBM Global Services. So we were a successful acquisition. But for those of us in data sciences, it was a bloody nightmare. They phoned us up on the Friday. They had acquired us by the Sunday. We went from a 3-level hierarchy, small, 2 cultures. Dutch and English are very different cultures. And I was Welsh, so we stood on the side of both, right? And then suddenly you're in this international conglomerate with so many levels of management, you don't even know who you report to anymore. And the first thing they did was to charge us for coffee and ban alcohol. Now, this is completely unreasonable. The coffee-alcohol cycle is essential to good software development. Nobody should be expected to speak to users without alcohol first. You then need coffee to sober up. And then you need even more alcohol because users never want what you can prove they asked for when you deliver it. They now discover they want something else instead. I'm going to come back to that one again in a minute. So either way, we got a bit pissed off with this. It wasn't much fun. But we worked our way around it, and we basically hired meeting rooms where people would bill us for the meeting room and wouldn't mention the coffee and the alcohol. All right? There's ways around bureaucracy. Then it got worse. They told us we couldn't buy food for staff anymore. Now, by now I'm a C-level executive, all right? That means I only see clients when they're really very angry. Now, if you don't know this, the higher you get promoted, the more stressful a life you have, because you only ever see clients when they're absolutely, totally pissed off with the organization, right? So you're there in the crisis management role. And we'd learned by now that you didn't argue with IBM bureaucrats on the basis of customer need, employee need, logic, or anything else. None of that worked, right? The only thing which occasionally worked was a technique from philosophy called the Socratic technique. This is where you ask people questions till they contradict themselves and have to come around to your point of view. It's a very dangerous technique if you don't know it. I mean, Socrates finally had to go and drink poison because the people of Athens got a bit fed up of being constantly proving them to themselves that they were wrong, all right? So it's a hazardous enterprise, but it's fun, all right, while it lasts. So we went and we said, okay, this is interesting. We would never have thought of banning food for staff. This is one of the real benefits of joining IBM. And then we discovered they didn't understand irony, so it became a deadly weapon. You could switch on and off in chat rooms with HTML code during conference calls. Yeah? And we said, what do we do at 4 o'clock in the morning? I said, I'll give you a real case. I get called out at 4 o'clock. We got an emergency service running on VAX clusters. The VAX clusters are down. There's been an operating system malfunction on an upgrade. If it's not up at 9 a.m., not only do we have massive penalty clauses, but actually 999 calls won't go through. And I said, I'm a manager. I don't understand VAX clusters. That's way beyond me. All I can actually do is keep the employees motivated and awake, and I do that by buying them copious amounts of pizza and Coke. And they looked at me with this shocked expression on their face, and I realized it could have been misinterpreted. And I said, we do mean the drink, just to be clear on that. Yeah, did give us some ideas for real crises later on, but it's amazing what people will believe. So I've just come from California, which is always an interesting experience. So they said, okay. They said, well, we can understand you might need to do that. We'll agree that, provided you get vice presidential approval 48 hours in advance. Now, at this time, you breathe deeply. And you say, my God, we would never have thought of that. Yeah? And then you start to realize that sarcasm is a weapon as well as irony. We said, what happens on the extremely rare occasion where we don't get 48 hours notice of a major crisis? Well, this is a Socratic technique, all right? You just got to be patient, right? And then they said yes in a way, which means no. Bureaucrats are really good at this, all right? So they said country general manager approval after the event. Now you know that means your expenses will disappear into IBM South Bank. They'll never be signed. If you complain about it, your name will start to appear on the wrong sorts of lists. You know those lists which are drawn up every quarter in service companies. So the practice emerged, and I hasten to add, I never did this, and nobody I knew ever did it, all right? We just wouldn't do this, but we heard about other people doing this, of over-tipping London taxi drivers. Because if you overtip a London taxi driver, they give you a blank receipt. And I'm told that the blank receipt was then filled in for the amount of the food and Coke bought for the staff. A parallel set of books were kept to prove that the staff had actually received a benefit, and the responsible manager took a bus and claimed the taxi fare. All right, now this is 20 years ago. I gave this example at a conference in Berlin a year ago and in Dubai a few months ago. On both occasions, people from IBM ran up and showed me their wallets full of blank receipts and said, we're still doing that, did you invent it? If you over-constrain a system which can't be naturally constrained, people find workarounds. Yeah, it's a lovely Scottish word, look it up if you don't know it, it's called being canny. It's being clever in a sort of mischievous, sly sort of way. People will find a workaround, which actually means you're wasting a huge amount of energy. Some of the work I do now is to map the amount of wastage caused by excessive bureaucracy, which is given the appearance of order, but underneath it requires huge amounts of goodwill people to make the system work despite itself. And the depressing thing is we're seeing that happening with SAFe in Agile. SAFe will only work if good people ignore the total construct and work around it. Yeah, and again, that over-constraint is actually quite dangerous. So that's an ordered system. Very valuable in limited circumstances. In a chaotic system, there are no constraints. So the system is random. Now, if that happens accidentally, so for example, you excessively constrain a system, everybody breaks the rules, rule breaking then becomes the norm, the system breaks catastrophically, that's a disaster. If, like IBM, you assume that your market for hardware is infinitely available at high margins, when it isn't, you get a catastrophic failure and the organization almost dies. So that's an inadvertent collapse into chaos. Yeah? On the other hand, if you enter it deliberately, then you can actually, in a system without constraints, you get complete novelty for innovation, or you get that ability I've already mentioned to get mass human agents to interpret stuff in real time. That's called wisdom of crowds in the literature. So chaos is highly useful, provided you understand when it can be used and when it should be avoided. Yeah, complete randomness, if you can achieve it, has advantages, but it has to be constrained. Then we get complex adaptive systems. In a complex adaptive system, we've only really known about these for a few decades scientifically, although we've lived them all our lives. In a complex adaptive system, there are so many impacting facts, we call them modulators, that you never ever get any repeating pattern except by accident. The same thing will never happen again the same way twice except by accident. Although there's a thing called retrospective coherence, you may only see the things which appear to repeat, which can actually be dangerous in that respect. So I've got so many things interacting continuously, there's no way I can introduce a traditional cause and effect relationship. And the way this is normally expressed is a complex adaptive system isn't causal, it's dispositional. I can basically say the system is disposed to evolve in this way, and it's unlikely to evolve in this ways, but I can never make completely accurate statements. Which is why in complexity, you map the present and you see what you can do in the present to change things. You don't define a future state. That is the massive difference between complexity thinking and systems thinking. In systems thinking, you design an ideal future state, company culture, you define values, you define business objectives, and you say this is where we want to be, and you close. In complexity, you focus on mapping the present, identifying where you can change things in the present, then as you change them, monitoring it very quickly so you can reinforce good things and disrupt bad things. There's a whole new approach, by the way, in object-oriented systems architecture in which we allow applications to be the emergent property of software objects interacting with identity structures in people over time, which is, by the way, how social media works. Yeah, most social media applications aren't designed, they emerge. Yeah? Now, the best way I've ever learned to explain this, because the basic principle is what type of system I'm in, I will manage in a different way. And that's the revolutionary idea. For the last few decades, people have tried to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. Yeah, we got this method, it's universal. What complexity says is methods are right or wrong within boundaries. A method which is a good method for complexity will be disastrous for order and vice versa. And that really is quite revolutionary. So the best way I've ever learned to explain this is to think about managing a party for a bunch of 9-year-old kids. Can everybody imagine running a party for a bunch of 9-year-old kids? Okay, so I want you to imagine how you're going to manage this party. The first thing you have to decide is what type of system is it? Is it ordered? Is it complex? Is it chaotic? Well, if it's chaotic, it means the children are acting without constraints completely at random. That means they'll probably discover drugs and alcohol and go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Yeah, your house may be destroyed in the process, but it was socially constructed in the first place, so why are you worried about it? There's a stiletto in that for some academic colleagues. I don't recommend this. I've got a friend in California who tried it once. He's never ever going to do it again. And he's now adopted a very sensible process of actually having parties in community centres, because community centres have fire hoses, which are useful for cleaning up after the party and occasionally necessary for crowd control during the party itself. Yeah? So treating the party as chaotic is probably a mistake. Ordered approaches, on the other hand, have a huge amount of agile certification available for you. Yeah? Under this, you agree learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives are aligned with the mission statement for education in the community to which you belong, and are clearly articulated and printed off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropping into ponds. And you place those posters around the room where you're going to hold the party. Yeah? You then, as the kids come into the party, you give them Disney playing cards with a company value statement clearly printed on the back of it, so they're aware of what they're meant to do. Yeah? And of course, you produced a project plan for the party. The project plan should have clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. And the senior adult starts the party with a motivational videotape. You don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. Yeah? And then they use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the party objectives and show the children how their allowances are linked to the achievement of the outcome targets. Following the highly successful completion of the party, you conduct an Afteraction review, and you actually mandate new best practice across the whole of your local community. If at this stage, for any remote reason, the children aren't happy, then you either acquire appreciative inquiry practitioner who will tell them to tell happy clappy stories so they have happy mental models and suitably indoctrinated like whatever you put in front of them next time, or you bring in a happiness consultant, yeah, or any of those variations. Yeah? Now, this is not advised, all right? The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is much simpler. We start off by drawing a line in the sand. This is a constraint or a boundary in complexity terms. We look the children squarely in the eye, and we say, "Cross that, you little bastards, and you die." And one of the things you learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries, because rigid boundaries have a habit of breaking catastrophically when you least expect them. We then introduce catalytic probes, a football, a videotape, a barbecue, a computer game, in a hope a pattern of play will form. That's called an attractor. If it's beneficial, we give it resources. If it's not beneficial, well, that's where you deploy the fire hoses. What we actually do is we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within boundaries, within attractors. Well, technically, within attractors, within boundaries. Now, if you start to think about software design like this, you start to think about it very differently. Actually, you would never manage a party the way I satirized. So why do you ever manage business the same way? The reality is you use far less energy to manage boundary conditions and catalytic probes and amplification strategy than by deciding in advance exactly what things should be. You may have a sense of direction, but you don't have a goal. Oh, and by the way, if you don't know Goodhart's law in economics, any statistical instrument used for policy loses all value. Marilyn Strathern translated that as the minute a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a measure. If you actually set defined targets, people focus on achieving the target regardless of the consequences, and you get unexpected consequences. The one thing I can guarantee you about any complex adaptive system is whatever you do, there will be unintended consequences, and you are ethically responsible for them. The larger your intervention, the larger the unexplained consequences, and the less likely people are to admit failure. That, by the way, is also the marketing genius of SAFE. It costs companies so much money to enter into it that even when it fails, and it is failing, companies won't admit to it because of the amount of money spent on the process, and it takes 2 years to get the benefit, so the responsibility of the executive job hops. If we don't know that phenomenon in large companies, you need to learn it. Is actually bring in consultants to create a wonderful new approach which will take 18 months to 2 years to implement, claim all the credit for the benefits you say will happen, and move on to another job before the consequences hit you. That's actually a survival strategy in large corporates. Okay, so I kind of made the point, made the science. Now let me introduce the Cynefin framework. Cynefin is a Welsh word. It doesn't translate into English. The English don't have a word which is an equivalent, which kind of says something about them. They translate it as habitat. Nobody in Wales would use it for anything that trivial. What it actually means is the place of your multiple belongings. It's a sense of being in a continuous flow of meaning over time. It's never static. So it's not the same as the German Heimat, for example. There's a sense of flow or continuity. The reason the English don't have an equivalent is they've never had a place of their own. They've only ever stolen other people's. We haven't forgiven them for the 13th century, and we don't plan to anytime soon. We have long memories in the world. So it's a good name for a complexity model, because in complexity, you can kind of know where you are, and you sort of know where you've come from, but you don't fully understand the cause and effect. In fact, it's inherently understandable, but you've got to manage that flow. Think of it as riding a canoe down a fast-flowing river. Rather than being able to hold things steady and decide where to go, you've got to constantly make decisions, because nothing ever stays the same. So that's a basic principle. So the Cynefin framework is, and hopefully this will now work, I always get that word at the point, is drawn like this. It's not drawn, just to be clear, it's not drawn like this, and add that in later because you think I may notice it online. Right? It's not the approach. It's drawn like that. It's got the central zone of disorder. That's the state of not knowing which of the other subsystems you're actually in. So this is disorder here. And that's a bad place to be. That's where I don't know, is a system ordered, or is it complex, or is it chaotic? So I'll tend to do whatever I find most comfortable. What Cynefin then does is it divides order into two. It divides it into where the cause and relationship is obvious and where it's complicated. And that difference is obvious because if the relationship between cause and effect is obvious and self-evident, you don't need to worry about explaining things, people just will do it. So as you all know, in civilized countries, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. I'm not sure about that post-Brexit. I think we've destroyed our qualification to be civilized after that, but that's another matter, all right? The British and the Americans are competing for the most stupid electoral decisions at the moment, all right, just to see who can do it. Having said that, the polls have come close recently as well. So basically what happens is if you come into, sorry, I couldn't resist that, all right? If you come into the UK, and you drive on the right-hand side of the road, expect negative consequences, right? We could have chosen to drive on the right. I remember in the 60s where the Swedes went from driving on the left to driving on the right one weekend. Their government had the sense to ignore a referendum which said they wanted to stay the same, right? Basically, it was chaotic, but it made sense because all the countries around them also drove on the right. It's a decision we make, we go with it, right? So the decision model there is very simply, we sense, we categorize, we respond, and we apply best practice. And what we've actually got is rigid or fixed constraints. Now, that's a good area to be in. It's nice and predictable. Everything is wonderful. It's very low energy cost. It's a very dangerous space, though, because you've over-constrained it. You get this collapse into chaos. So the bottom bit of Cynefin is actually drawn like this, because this space here is chaos, and this is drawn as a cliff. If I fall over this, this area here is a zone of complacency. I actually think everything is working. If anybody has ever driven in Sorrento in southern Italy, if you actually believe that traffic follows the law, you've got a disaster waiting to happen, all right? I caused a mass shunt in Naples the first time I drove there because the traffic light started to turn red, so I slowed down. The car behind me reacted in time, but there was a mass pile-up before because in Naples you go faster and there's an accepted 2 minutes to carry on going through the red light before the other traffic arrives, all right? So you can get this wrong, right? By the way you drive in Naples is match speed, avoid collision, follow the next car. It's been studied. Italian drivers south of Naples drive like birds flock. Then it's quite relaxing if you go through it, right? So basically, I don't want to have that sort of catastrophic failure. If I do, then I actually have to get out fast. So that's act, sense, respond. Sorry, get the color right. So what I do here is I act, sense, respond. Now the good news is there are no constraints, and actually practice is always novel. It's completely different. You've never had a better chance to do something different than when there's a major crisis. In fact, a crisis is the best opportunity you'll ever have to innovate, because then people are open to novelty. You can't innovate during periods of stability. You can only innovate during periods of disruption. Now, if it's complicated, that means the relationships between cause and effect are not self-evident, but they can be discovered through analysis or the application of expertise. So the model here is sense, analyze, respond, and practice, of course, here is good, not best, and the constraints are what are called governing constraints. So basically, within a boundary, I can vary what I do. A big mistake in consultancy-led initiatives is to force people into one approach. If they've got deep expertise, they should be allowed some variety in how they approach it. Agile does tend to this. It tends to methods which have been designed to be trained rather than to be practiced. And of course, if you need to train, you need rigid processes because it's easier to train. So you can see that problem, and it's a general problem on methods worldwide. Now, of course, from that, we get the complex domain. In the complex domain, the way I manage it is parallel safe-to-fail experiments. I probe, sense, respond. But I do it in parallel, not in sequence. So if I've got 15 or 16 coherent ideas about what the right thing is to do, I don't try and resolve that. Each of those ideas gets a small amount of resource to run a limited time frame experiment in parallel with the other ideas. because the only way I can understand what's possible is by acting within the system. Okay? Now that's actually where Agile fails. I'll come back to that in a minute with the final slide, which will be the liminal version of Cynefin. And practice here is emergent. And what you actually have are what are called enabling constraints, not governing constraints. Now that's a really important distinction. It's a difference between rules and heuristics. So I'll give you some military examples of that. Napoleon's famous innovation in warfare was to tell his generals to march to the sounds of the gun. That was revolutionary because before that, everybody followed orders or acted autonomously. Now they have a governing principle, which means they know roughly what to do, and they know what other generals around them will be doing. So there's a degree of distributed cognition or distributed intelligence in the system. The US Marines have 3 rules, which is capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep learning. Sorry, keep communicating, keep in touch. Yeah, capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep moving. Now notice those are empirically measurable. They're not abstract principles like put customers first, which can be reinterpreted. They're concrete and tangible. Yeah, so heuristics, actually one of the big things we do for companies is extract heuristics from their day-to-day narratives, codify them, attach them to teaching stories, and they provide better governance structures than rules. Yeah, if you look at military terms, they're a better way of expressing commander's intent than precise plans. So complexity is all about handling what I call necessary or essential ambiguity. So that's the basic Cynefin framework. Now if I move on from that, and now I'll start to apply it to Agile, so I can basically come into the same framework. Yeah, let's draw it slightly differently this time. Again, the same picture. But now I add another boundary condition. Yeah? And this is called the liminal version of Cynefin. And it goes roughly like this. Again, it's a single line. And it creates effectively 2 liminal areas. Now, liminality is a key concept in anthropology. In indigenous communities, when somebody puts on a mask, they become, say, a witch doctor. There's a state of transition between being who they are and being the role implied by the mask, and that's called liminality. So a liminal condition is a state of transition which holds open possibilities to go back or to go onwards. Yeah? So the liminality here is key. So if I'm going to do this very simply, and let's just do some broad categories. Basically, over here, this is Waterfall. Nothing wrong with Waterfall. If you know exactly what you've got to achieve, you know what resources, what you want to do, create a traditional project. Yeah, there's techniques like Prince 2 which work fine done. Yeah, no issue with them. Yeah, trying to make everything agile is a mistake. Over here, there are techniques like time boxes that we've tended to forget. I mean, just because a sprint is 2 weeks, it doesn't mean a time box can't be 3 months. We used to do a lot of this in the 80s and 90s. You know, I guarantee you a delivery date, but I'll vary the resource or the delivery to achieve it. And there are other techniques in that space. Again, what I'm trying to do is say what a framework should do is open up possibilities rather than constrain you to one way of working. Yeah, nothing wrong with time boxes. Scrum's huge strength, and Scrum has been absolutely vital to all of this, is Scrum sits here. The great strength of Scrum is to hold things in a liminal state of transmission so that things don't come out of the complex domain too quickly. That's called premature convergence. But it's in that liminal domain because it's a linear experiment based on a partially known requirement. Yeah? The thing that we've got to start to work on more is stuff over here. Now, interestingly, I think one of the problems with Agile is that although it starts in things like XP, it then starts to become coterminous with Scrum, which does no good to Scrum and no good to Agile. The problem is, although XP had a lot of valuable techniques, most people who are good XP programmers are unable to communicate with ordinary mortals. Sorry about that, but it's true. So they didn't get the same adoption. Yeah, but we can come back to some techniques. Let me just throw out 3 things we're working on here to give an idea. One of the things we're currently about to start is a development of pair programming where we have 3. So we have the traditional pair, and then we add to it a user trained to talk to IT people. It's much easier to train users to communicate to IT than train good IT people to understand users. Sorry about that, but it is. Yeah, I'll tell you in private the techniques we borrowed from to do that. Yeah? But what I also want to do is to engage users more intimately in the execution process, not just the requirement state. So putting a trio onto abstract problems is going to be more successful, particularly if they're trained to work together. So that's a development of pair programming. Another one is the 888 method. Yeah? So I'm just throwing these out to give you some ideas. In the 888 method, this is something I developed when we set up DSDM many years ago, is basically you get a JAD team, a joint application design team, prototypers trained to work with users, and good prototypers are generally poor executors of operational code. It's kind of like the two abilities don't go the same way. They work together with the users over 8 hours. They throw the prototype onto another team, to say they do that in London. It then goes to Bangalore without the user requirement. And the Bangalore team are told that they've got 8 hours to produce a better version of the prototype they get without knowledge of what it was developed. Then they hand it on to San Francisco for another 8-hour process. It comes back to the same user team at the end of that. Effectively, I'm forcing mutation to handle uncertainty. Every time we've done it, users have looked at the result and said, oh my God, I wouldn't go to that, can I have it? Yeah? You manage uncertainty by methods that build uncertainty into them. And the final one we're working on is unanticipated need. And the way unanticipated needs is you effectively get users to continuously capture their day-to-day frustrations with IT, with things which should have IT. That's kind of like the math sense I talked about. When you get statistically significant clusters of observational data, you put a pair programming team or a trio programming team on it to build a prototype. Yeah? You don't have a story point, because a story point filters out raw user experience, and therefore you lose essential data. Now, I've given you 3 techniques, there's a lot more. What I'm basically trying to say is if we want Agile to survive, we've got to make it a flexible, fluid framework of multiple tools from multiple backgrounds. Kanban works very well in the complicated space, but it's poor for complex. On the other hand, the work in progress idea is a good one, but the way you represent work in progress in complex is not a series of cards in columns, but is a landscape map of potentiality. So we need to start to recognize the need for essential diversity for variation and effectively for mixed and multiple methods. And we need to switch the focus of Agile away from accreditation and on to delivery. And experience matters more than certificates, and we need to recognize that. Thank you very much for your time.